Picture this. You're a medieval peasant with zero construction experience, no Home Depot, and your only tools are whatever you can make with your bare hands and maybe borrow from that one neighbor who actually knows what he's doing. Your landlord has told you to build a house or get evicted, and oh, by the way, winter is coming in 3 months. No pressure, right? Today we're diving into the absolutely insane world of medieval DIY home construction, where one wrong move could literally bring the roof down on your head. And spoiler alert, it happened more often than you'd think. Stick around because I'm about to reveal the shocking truth about how our ancestors built homes that some of them actually survived living in, plus the one crucial mistake that turned countless peasant homes into medieval death traps that'll make you never complain about IKEA furniture again. Let's start with the elephant in the medieval room. Peasants didn't exactly have a lot of housing options. You couldn't just scroll through Zillow and find a nice 2-bedroom cottage with updated plumbing because, newsflash, plumbing didn't exist, and neither did your right to own property. Most peasants were basically medieval tenants, renting land from their local lord who had all the charm of a parking meter and twice the compassion. The deal was simple. You work the lord's land, give him most of your crops, and in return, he graciously allows you to not die of exposure by building yourself a little hovel on his property. It's like the world's worst landlord-tenant relationship, except your landlord carries a sword and has legal permission to make your life miserable. The pressure was real because if you couldn't build a decent shelter before winter hit, you'd literally freeze to death, which was apparently considered a personal failing rather than a systemic housing crisis. And here's the kicker. You had to do it all while working full-time in the fields because medieval peasants apparently invented the side hustle out of sheer survival necessity. The whole situation was so stressful that building a house became less of a home improvement project and more of an extreme sport where the stakes were life and death. Now, before you start feeling sorry for modern contractors complaining about supply chain issues, let me introduce you to the medieval tool situation, which was basically what you'd get if someone took every tool from Home Depot and launched them into the sun. The average peasant's entire toolkit consisted of maybe an axe if they were lucky, a knife that was probably more rust than metal, and their own 2 hands that were already busy with farming, cooking, and trying not to die of various medieval plagues. Forget power tools. They didn't even have proper hand tools. Most peasants had to literally make their own tools before they could make anything else, which is like being told to build a computer before you can use one to order pizza. The wealthy peasants, and yes, that's as oxymoronic as it sounds, might have owned a hammer or a chisel, making them basically the medieval equivalent of that neighbor who owns a pressure washer and suddenly becomes everyone's best friend. But here's where it gets really ridiculous. Even if you had tools, you had to share them with the entire village because nobody could afford duplicates. Imagine trying to build a house when you have to wait in line to use a hammer, and the person before you is also building a house, and the person after you is fixing their roof that collapsed last week because they also had to wait in line to use the same hammer. The whole system was more dysfunctional than a group project in college, except with much higher stakes and significantly more splinters. Getting building materials in medieval times was like playing a real-life survival game, where the trees fight back and the rocks have attitude. You couldn't just drive to Lowe's and load up on 2x4s. You had to go into the forest, find suitable trees, cut them down with your questionable tools, and then somehow drag these massive logs back to your building site using nothing but rope, willpower, and probably a lot of medieval swear words that we've thankfully forgotten. But wait, it gets worse. You couldn't just cut down any tree because forests belonged to the Lord, and unauthorized tree cutting was basically grand theft lumber, punishable by anything from hefty fines to having your hands removed, which would make the whole house building project significantly more challenging. So peasants had to either pay for the privilege of cutting down trees on Lord's land, or venture into the sketchy parts of the forest where nobody was watching, but also where wolves, bears, and bandits were having their own medieval block parties. Even if you successfully acquired lumber without losing any limbs, you then had to season the wood, which means letting it dry for months or years to prevent warping. But remember, you needed shelter before winter, so most peasants used greenwood and just hoped their house wouldn't twist itself into a pretzel by spring. The really desperate ones would scavenge wood from abandoned buildings, which was like shopping at medieval Goodwill, except everything was potentially cursed and definitely infested with unknown medieval creatures that went bump in the night. Medieval foundation work was where peasant construction dreams went to die faster than a smartphone battery in winter. The concept was simple enough. Dig holes, put stones in holes, build house on stones. Easy, right? Wrong. First, peasants had to figure out where to put their house, which involved complex medieval calculations like, where is the ground sort of flat, and will this spot flood when it rains? And spoiler alert, they got it wrong more often than a weather forecast. Digging was done entirely by hand with tools that were more suggestions than actual implements. So foundation holes often ended up looking like abstract art pieces rather than geometric shapes. The stone gathering process was its own adventure because good foundation stones were heavy, and moving heavy things without machinery meant convincing your neighbors to help you, which required either bribery with ale or promises to help them with their equally doomed construction projects. But here's the truly hilarious part. Most peasants had zero understanding of soil composition, drainage, or basic engineering principles, so they'd confidently build foundations on swampy ground, sandy soil, or directly over underground streams, then act surprised when their houses sank, tilted, or simply vanished into the earth like medieval Atlantis. The lucky ones whose houses stayed upright often discovered that their foundations were so uneven that their doors wouldn't close, their floors slanted like funhouse attractions, and their furniture had to be propped up with rocks to keep from sliding into one corner. Medieval peasants essentially invented the fixer-upper thousands of years before HGTV made it trendy. Building walls in medieval times was like playing Jenga, except the pieces were irregularly shaped, covered in mud, and your life literally depended on them staying upright. The most popular construction method was called Wattle and daub, which sounds like a fancy coffee drink, but was actually a technique involving weaving branches together like the world's most structural basket, then covering the whole thing in mud, animal hair, and whatever else was lying around that might stick. The wattle part required peasants to become part-time basket weavers, cutting flexible branches and weaving them between vertical posts and patterns that supposedly would hold up a roof, but often looked more like abstract sculptures created by someone with serious depth perception issues. Finding the right kind of branches was crucial, because too thick and you couldn't weave them, too thin and they'd snap under pressure, and too old and they'd crumble like medieval crackers, leaving you with walls that had the structural integrity of wet cardboard. The daub part was where things got really creative and disgusting because the mixture typically included mud, straw, animal dung, and sometimes hair from whatever animals were available, creating a paste that smelled like a farm accident and had the consistency of chunky peanut butter. Peasants would slap this delightful mixture onto their woven walls with their bare hands, smoothing it out while trying not to think too hard about what exactly they were touching, and praying that the whole thing would dry into something resembling a wall rather than just falling off in chunks when the first strong wind hit. Medieval roofing was where peasant optimism went to die in a spectacular display of gravity, weather, and poor planning. Thatch roofing was the go-to choice for peasants, partly because straw was relatively available and partly because they had literally no other options that didn't involve selling their souls or their remaining livestock. The process started with creating a wooden frame that was supposed to support the thatch, but since most peasants were about as skilled at carpentry as cats are at quantum physics, these frames often resembled modern art installations more than functional roof structures. The thatching process involved layering bundles of straw in overlapping rows, starting from the bottom and working up, which sounds simple until you realize you're doing this while balanced on wobbly wooden beams 20 feet off the ground with no safety equipment whatsoever. Peasants had to tie each bundle of thatch to the roof frame using rope or strips of bark, and the whole thing had to be dense enough to keep out rain, but not so heavy that it would collapse the walls, which was apparently a much more difficult balance to achieve than you might think. The real nightmare began when the weather turned bad because thatch roofs were basically giant sponges that would soak up water, become incredibly heavy, and then either leak like sieves or collapse entirely, often in the middle of the night when families were sleeping peacefully below. Maintenance was a constant battle because birds loved to nest in thatch. Insects treated it like an all-you-can-eat buffet, and strong winds could literally blow your roof away, leaving you standing in your house looking up at the sky, wondering where exactly your ceiling had gone and whether your home insurance policy covered acts of medieval God. Creating openings in medieval peasant houses was like performing surgery with a spoon. Technically possible, but fraught with opportunities for disaster. Most peasants approached door and window placement with all the precision of throwing darts blindfolded, often cutting holes in their freshly built walls only to realize they made them too big, too small, or in locations that made their houses structurally unsound. The door situation was particularly tragic because peasants rarely had access to proper hinges, so they had to get creative with leather straps, rope, or whatever else they could find to hang their doors, resulting in entryways that opened with all the grace of a broken accordion and closed with the finality of a medieval death trap. Windows were even more problematic because glass was a luxury item more expensive than gold, so most peasant windows were simply holes in the wall covered with whatever was available. Animal skins, cloth, wooden shutters that fit about, as well as medieval contact lenses, or absolutely nothing at all, which made for exciting weather experiences inside the house. The lack of proper windows meant that peasant homes were either freezing cold caves when the openings were covered, or wind-swept disaster zones when they were left open, with no middle ground between hypothermia and having your dinner blown off the table by Arctic gusts. Many peasants tried to be clever by making their windows tiny to minimize heat loss. But this created homes with all the natural lighting of a medieval dungeon, forcing families to choose between being able to see what they were eating or being able to feel their fingers while they ate it. The whole door and window situation led to houses that were less like homes and more like poorly designed igloos with attitude problems and serious boundary issues. Medieval peasant interior decorating made modern minimalism look like a hoarder's paradise because most peasants owned approximately 3 things: a cooking pot, a sleeping mat, and a crushing sense of existential dread about their living conditions. The floor was typically just packed dirt, which sounds rustic and charming until you realize that dirt floors meant your home was basically a large, covered hole in the ground that turned into a mud pit every time it rained. And since medieval roofs leaked like broken fountains, it rained inside almost as much as it rained outside. Furniture was a luxury that most peasants couldn't afford, so they had to build everything themselves using their non-existent carpentry skills and leftover scraps from house construction, resulting in tables that wobbled like drunk horses, chairs that collapsed under normal human weight, and beds that were more like medieval torture devices than comfortable sleeping arrangements. The walls were typically left bare because wallpaper hadn't been invented and paint was expensive, so peasants lived surrounded by the same mud and straw mixture they'd slapped on the outside, except now they got to stare at it every day while contemplating their life choices. Heating was provided by a central fire pit that filled the house with smoke because chimneys were still centuries away from being invented. So medieval peasants had to choose between freezing to death or slowly suffocating in their own homes, which explains why they spent so much time working outside, even in terrible weather. Storage was whatever containers peasants could make or trade for, usually baskets or pottery that they'd place strategically around their one-room homes, creating obstacle courses that they'd navigate by memory in the dark, because artificial lighting consisted of maybe one candle if they were feeling wealthy, or burning sticks if they were being practical about their financial situation. Moving into a freshly built medieval peasant house was like unwrapping a present that you'd made yourself while blindfolded, full of surprises and not necessarily good ones. The first night in a new medieval home was typically when families discovered all the things they'd done wrong during construction, like walls that let in more wind than a screen door, roofs that leaked in places they hadn't even realized they created, and floors that were somehow less level than the ground outside had been before they'd started building. Most peasant families spent their first few weeks in their new homes frantically trying to patch holes, reinforce walls, and figure out why their house made noises like a haunted accordion every time the wind blew, which in medieval times was basically always. The chimney situation, or lack thereof, meant that the first time they tried to cook dinner, they'd fill their house with so much smoke that they couldn't see across the room, leading to the medieval equivalent of setting off every smoke alarm in the house, except there were no smoke alarms, and also they couldn't leave because they'd literally just built this place with their bare hands. Many peasants discovered that their doors didn't actually keep anything out because they'd either made them too small for the frame or too big, resulting in gaps that allowed in rain, snow, small animals, and occasionally larger animals who were just as confused about the door situation as everyone else. The window situation created its own entertainment because peasants would wake up to find birds, bats, or other flying creatures had moved in during the night, apparently under the impression that the house was just a very elaborate outdoor shelter with a confusing roof situation. By the end of the first month, most peasant families had either become amateur contractors out of necessity or learned to live with housing problems that would make modern building inspectors weep openly. Maintaining a medieval peasant house was like trying to keep a sandcastle intact during a hurricane while blindfolded and using only a spoon. Theoretically possible, but practically a nightmare that never ended. Every season brought new challenges that tested both the structural integrity of the house and the mental stability of its inhabitants. Starting with spring, when melting snow revealed all the damage that winter had inflicted while everyone was huddled inside, pretending their walls weren't slowly disintegrating. Summer was when the thatch roof became a fire hazard because one spark from the cooking fire could turn the entire house into a medieval bonfire. And also, when the wattle and daub walls would dry out and start cracking, creating gaps that would later let in winter weather like a medieval air conditioning system that only worked when you didn't want it to. Fall was roof repair season because peasants had to replace damaged thatch before winter, but since they were also busy harvesting crops and preparing food for the cold months, house maintenance often got pushed to the bottom of the priority list, right between learn to read and invent better farming tools. Winter was when all the construction shortcuts came back to haunt peasants because poorly built houses would literally fall apart under the weight of snow. Inadequate foundations would shift and crack from frost, and heating systems that barely worked in good weather would fail completely, leaving families to choose between burning furniture for warmth or freezing to death in their handmade homes. The most successful medieval peasants were those who learned to see house maintenance as a year-round hobby rather than a seasonal chore, constantly patching, rebuilding, and reinforcing their homes in an endless cycle that made modern homeownership look like a relaxing vacation by comparison. But hey, at least they never had to deal with HOA fees or property taxes, so maybe they were onto something after all. So there you have it. Medieval peasants were basically the original extreme home makeover participants, except instead of Ty Pennington, they had Black Death. Instead of a design team, they had whatever neighbors hadn't died recently. And instead of 7 days, they had whatever time they could squeeze between not starving and not freezing to death. These people built houses with literally nothing but determination, desperation, and an alarming lack of building codes, and somehow managed to create shelters that kept them alive long enough to have children who would grow up and repeat the entire insane process. The next time you're frustrated with IKEA instructions or waiting for a contractor to call you back, just remember that your ancestors built entire homes using tools they made themselves, materials they gathered by hand, and construction techniques they learned through trial and error, where the error could literally kill them. If you enjoyed learning about medieval construction disasters and want to see more historically hilarious content about how our ancestors survived despite their best efforts to accidentally eliminate themselves, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we're diving into medieval cooking disasters, and trust me, their kitchen failures make their construction failures look competent by comparison.